The labels are there for us, right? They're there because humans love labels. We love putting things in boxes. But it's the Edward Box quote, all models are wrong. Some are useful. So we've been labeling things because it's useful, not because it's accurate.
I had a conversation with Julia, an author of this book, Introduction to Ecological Psychology. I did a longer video essay exploring my interpretations of the information, and I had a conversation and I cut it up into this video discussing some of the emergent topics that came out of this conversation with how we interact with the world, how we behave in the world, and maybe if you're new to ecological psychology or you're familiar with ecological psychology, you could relate to some of the topics that come up.
No, I was just saying that once you start down that road of ecological and you start really delving into it and pulling it apart, you go, oh, this is everywhere. This is in all of my interactions. It's in all of the places that I go through. I was actually talking recently to a student about the notion of fractality. He's doing a project of his on fractality. And and I started being like, well, and this is fractal, and this is fractal, and this is fractal. And he's like, whoa, hang on a second. Is there anything that's not fractal? I was like, oh, sure. And he goes, right, but how about this? And I went, no, yeah, that's fractal. And he went, how about this? Is that fractal? Yeah, that's fractal. I said, this is the thing. At some point, you start looking around your life anything you start, well, is that fractal? No, yeah, no, it turns out that is too. And you just start seeing it everywhere. It's just everywhere you look, you know? And even things that I thought were like purely mechanical. Very recently, because I'm writing a new book, Jeff and I are going to write a sensation and perception textbook. I started digging deeper into how the neuron works because I have to write a section on how the neuron works,
Okay.
Yes, like the neuron. And and I started realizing A, it's more complicated than I was taught, and B,
Isn't
it's
everything?
yes, and B, it is way more dynamic than I thought. It's much more about these different forces. So you have the chemical gradients, and then you have the magnetic gradients that the chemicals are working, that ions are working with and against. And it all just emerges. All of the actions of a neuron all just emerge out of like all of that complex dance of chemicals is all just an emergent property of the constraints that are already set up. And it's like even something that complex that we think of as being this very mechanical thing, nope, turns out that's dynamic too.
But
It's,
isn't neurons just active or inactive? It's ones and zeros.
no, no, that's not right now. Again, that's what we're taught, right? Like we're taught it's this, oh, it's one, it's no, nope, quite a bit more complicated than that, right? You learn in kindergarten that you have five senses. It isn't until you're in college and taking sensation and perception that people are like, no, it's like 30 plus. It depends on how you measure them.
It's
Just,
interesting. I remember doing an essay in my second year of my undergrad on proprioception
yeah.
because it's a sixth sense. And I'm like, well, when you
We're
look
like,
at the research, you've got kinesthesia and proprioception, which is slightly different, and touch is also slightly different because touch is kind of like taste, but it's not like taste. And you're like, well, how many senses are there then?
yeah. Well, and even taste, right? Because there's taste and smell, but then there's flavor, which is a combination of taste and smell and mouthfeel. And right, and you just start going, I don't think actually it helps us to put things in boxes here. And ultimately this is the lesson that I keep learning, right? I keep learning over and over again is every time you think that it makes sense to put things in boxes, almost always you find yourself going, yeah, those boxes aren't going to do it. We're going to need something more complicated than that.
If I was to summarize a main takeaway, the ecological approach, that's what it would be, is labels really aren't useful.
No, they're really not helping. No, and that's the thing. Like that's a lesson that you can spread across every area from, identities to how a neuron works to what a neuron even is, right? To many senses we have or how we interact with our environments, all of that stuff. The labels are there for us, right? They're there because humans love labels. We love putting things in boxes. But it's the Edward Box quote, all models are wrong. Some are useful. So we've been labeling things because it's useful, not because it's accurate.
I guess how does that shape or shift the way that you communicate with other people? Because I know I've noticed my language, sometimes deliberately, sometimes unintentionally. My language is drastically different from the way other people explain something. I assume by your nodding are the same.
Oh God, yes, absolutely. And and it comes up in funny places. And then I find myself talking to someone who has no idea what I'm talking about or is not in any way scientifically inclined. And they're using words, and I'm like, oh, that's not quite the right. And then I try to tell myself, like, it doesn't matter, Julia. Nobody cares but you. Right. It's like, it's hard. In the introduction to it, he talks about the like life of what it is to be a scientist and how there's these competing things, one of which is that you don't want to look like an idiot, right? You know that there's a subtle difference between kinesthetics and body touch and haptics. Like, you know that there's a difference between those things. And so you want other people to know that you know that there's a difference between those things. But that doesn't help you be a good teacher, right? That doesn't help you do a good job in a classroom or writing an intro to ecological textbook or like writing those things. You really bringing that language to a language other people can use, and being like, maybe this subtle difference, this isn't the time for that. That really spoke home to me, because I was like, yeah, I feel that sometimes in my interactions with people where I'm like, that's not quite what a fract, never mind. You know? Or
It's a case of like picking your fights. It's like, do I?
yeah, is this person really going to care about that distinction? No, I no, they will not care about that distinction.
There's a couple of things there. First one is before I had the language or the terminology from ecological psychology to use, I had a saying that I like to say a lot, which was meanings are in people, not words. So when yeah, I guess I found the the saying when I was coaching. A lot of people would say a word, but in trampoline, the performer on the trampoline would have a different meaning to the spotter that's standing next to me, to the parent that's sitting down, to what I meant by the word. I'm like,
Hmm.
meanings are in people, not words. And going through the book, I think in one of the sections it discusses meanings as affordances because it's relative to the
Yeah.
organism environment relationships. I'm like, okay, are words affordances?
Oh
Is the
yeah.
question that I started thinking about.
No, I think that's a really good point. I mean, I haven't thought about it in language in terms of that, but it's a really good point, because language is very much personally situated, because the association between meaning and the word is essentially arbitrary. Your awareness of what that word means is always going to be a little different than my awareness of what that word means. And God, and then you take a word like information, right? And the different ways that people have used that word to mean vastly different things. And so of course the information, or excuse me, of course the meaning is in the person and not in the word itself. It's in the way that they're expressing it. I like that. That's really good. I'm going to steal that.
When speaking and communicating using obviously science communication, I find myself struggling to navigate which words to use. Because if I'm speaking, for example, in the video, if I'm speaking to ecological psychologists and I say information, I imagine our meanings are somewhat similar.
Yeah.
But if the video goes to someone else, I may want to add a prefix and say, oh, ecological information.
Yeah, 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 exactly, exactly. No, I think it's a really good point about the science communication, and I think it's one. It's funny. I was just having this conversation with a colleague of mine about how science communication in general is incredibly difficult, because you do have to deal with the fact that words have a different meaning in this context than they do in like the general context, right? Even something as stupid as the word significant, right? You use that in a scientific context, and what we mean is we did statistics and we rejected a null, right? Where you use that in everyday speak and they mean important. Right. And so having to recognize that the person you're talking to fundamentally speaks a different language, and that you cannot use your language and think they will understand your language. So you have to use their language and use it the way they would use it in order to communicate, right? Because they're not going to learn science in order to listen to you. You have to speak normal person. And you have to be able to explain it without using the jargon. If you can't explain it without using the jargon, then you don't really understand it. And also the person you're talking to isn't going to understand it because they don't know your jargon.
Yeah, I feel like there's an element of truth there. I personally, so I've had my own conflicts with the Feynman technique because it's very, from what I've seen online, generalized. pick a topic, obviously, explain it, obviously, to whoever, and now you know and understand it. And my friction point with the explanation to a 5, 7, 10, whoever year old is just because you can explain something at their level doesn't necessarily mean you can explain it to someone else's level.
Yeah.
And I feel like people stop at the, well, I can explain it to a 7-year-old, so I must understand it.
Right.
You understand it to that level, at that scale of measurement, bringing back fractals.
Right, right, right. Or scale of complexity, I would say too. Like it's, and yes, it does matter that there is a subtle difference between kinesthetics and haptics and touch. Like it does matter that there's a difference between those things. It's just I don't think that matters for the basics, right? It doesn't matter for I just want to get started in this field and I can't get my feet under me because people are using all these words I don't understand and they're using them in a context I don't understand and I just want to get started because I really do. I think that the way that you learn things or at least the way that I have learned things is that I sort of have the immediate like central ideas and then it's like I'm hanging things on it like ornaments on a Christmas tree, right? Like I'm trying to like I understand this. Okay, well I'm going to add a little bit of detail to that and fill it in, and but if you start with none of the main structure and all you're being given are a bunch of ornaments, you've got nowhere to hang them. I think you're right. I think stopping at that seventh grade level, that's not where you stop, but it might be a good place to start.
Why and how would you get someone involved to explore? Would you say you need to motivate them to learn? Like how do you go about that sort of interaction?
Yeah, usually I find something that they care about. So, in a sports context, for example, you'd bring up Bernstein and you'd bring up the fact that between Bernstein and the notion that movement reveals invariance, it turns out you'll learn better if you have varied practice. And so, I participated in a study like this, actually. It was a basketball study where they had people learn the way you do a free throw, um, the classic way where you like just do it over and over and over again, the exact same motions over and over and over again. And then I was in the group that had varied practice. So we almost never touched a basketball. We threw big poofy balls and little hard ones, and all of them could fit through the hoop, like theoretically, but some of them just barely. They were all different weights and sizes and everything. And we stood all over the court, not just in that one free throw spot. If memory serves, we never did free throw spot plus basketball. So we never did the test condition. We only ever did all of the other things. And then for test, we did hold a basketball and at the free throw spot. And my group way outperformed the other group. Now, this is a bunch of novices, right? Like none of us are I'm not saying I'd never touched a basketball before that experiment, but close.
Yeah.
Um, but I made every single shot at the test. So I'm talking to a sports person and I'm saying like, here's why you should care is because it makes different predictions for what will work best in terms of learning a new skill or even um, getting better at a skill you already have. Right? Is that the classical view is going to say, well, practice the muscle units over and over and over again, and you'll get better. Our view will say, not really, no. What's going to make you get better is doing a lot of other things, accomplishing the goal in other ways, and that will get you better faster. And this is the thing is that that's how I do it, right? So that's how you talk to a person who is interested in sports, but there might be somebody who's interested in education, or there might be somebody who's interested in art, or there's somebody who's interested in physical therapy, or human factors or like whatever it is that they're interested in, you go, but did you know that my field is going to predict something different? And it might be why you're having so much trouble with this problem you're having. Right. So that's kind of how I increase the interest is to say it applies to you too.
When I have conversations with people that are outside of sport, they will say, well, it doesn't happen like this, or it must always happen then, or it must have always been happening. And I'm sitting here thinking, well, that's what we believe. Yes, you can't just not be ecologically inclined. It's a view, an explanation of the way that
Yeah.
we experience the world.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It's not like a switch. You're like, right, now I'm ecological.
No, it was always going on. You were just interpreting it differently. Yeah, absolutely. And I'm always surprised by the places it pops up too. So I'm in this writing group for new faculty trying to keep us on task. And there's a faculty member in there from the computer science department. And at the end of one of our writing sessions, he's like, well, today I wrote this whole section about affordances. And I was like, you did what? And he was like, oh, yeah, I mean, affordances. And he starts explaining to me what an affordance is. And I was like, no, no, honey, hang on. I know what that is. How do you know what that is? And he goes, oh, affordances are all over my field. And he goes, but everybody in my field thinks that they were invented by this person who I'd never heard of, but I think they were invented by Gibson. I was like, sir, let me give you my book. Right. And I did, and I gave it to him, and he like exactly like not to be that person, but have you read my book? But he did. He like went and took it out of the library and he read it, and now he's like going off. He's become an evangelical, Gibsonite, going out into the computer science world and being like, no, wait, everybody, there was more to that thing. It's not just affordances; it's a whole thing. So you never know when it's gonna take off. You never know when that's gonna be the thing that opens the box.
Computer science really interests me because most of them are very, uh, I don't want to say logical because I don't think that's an accurate term there, but they're very linear in the way that
Sure.
they think.
That's what I thought too. But I'm in talking with this guy, that's not what they think of themselves. I mean, in this one interaction I've had with this one computer scientist, he's like, that's not the way that we think about it. The way that we think about it is in this very broad and emergent thing, that this is another thing that we're interfacing with, right? So, like any other tool, the way that it is going to interact with people is something that has to emerge out of the complexity of people. And so you have to understand the way that people do things in order to understand how to make the best computer or how to make the best computer tool or how to best conceptualize the way we use these external tools we are now using with increasing regularity, like you know, the computers we carry around in our pockets, the way we interface with them is very much centered in the human cognitive process. So they spend apparently, which I have just learned, a ton of time talking and thinking about that at all of their conferences. So
How do you lecture ecologically?
explaining, he called it the freshman method, but it's very similar to what we were talking about earlier, explaining things at a lower level, assuming that your audience does not have the higher grasp of English. So using simple, vocabulary, stupid diagrams, because people can understand diagrams even if they can't understand English, and explaining things using sort of, although I guess I do explain things using embodied techniques because of that, right? So those stupid diagrams are a way of embodying the ideas into something that you can visually see. And I'm sure you saw this in my book, right? It's filled with all these diagrams. Those visual diagrams are a huge part of the way that I teach because they're a way of breaking down an idea into a visual, physical thing. And I think that makes it a little easier to understand. We talk about, for example, I just finished my semester, but recently we started talking about the ecological approach, and I was talking to them about, the stick perception, the wielding studies where you have the rod and then you either put the weight at the end of the rod or you put the weight in the middle or you put it next to your hand. And I said, right now, imagine what it would feel like to hold a stick with the weight at the end. So in your imagination, just wield that around, and what would that be good for? And everybody goes, a hammer, a weapon, a mace, right? And I was like, that's right. And now imagine that you have that same stick and we take that weight and we just put it right next to your hand and wheel that around in your imagination. What would that be good for? And they're like, a sword, poking, right? They can feel it, even though I never gave them the rod, I never gave them the weight. Simply asking them to sort of imagine it, you can feel what those things would feel like because you've felt things like them before. So one of my kids was like, yeah, the first one would do bludgeoning damage and the second one would do slashing damage. I'm like, yes, it would. Excellent D&D answer. Thank you.
My curiosity there is traditional approaches would explain it through a mental representation, the mind's eye.
No, I don't think that's a thing. No. No, I think if it was a mental representation, then we would expect that to stop as a mental representation. You wouldn't feel it in your body. And immediately all of those people could feel it, right? I mean, think about it. I was just explaining it to you, and I'm sure you immediately could feel what it would be like to have that rod in your hands with the weight at the end. You know what that would feel like, and your body feels it. It's not something that is sort of esoteric or separated from the experience of having wielded things like that. So for my money, I don't think it is a mental representation. When you are a classical theorist, you are interpreting the same behaviors through a different lens. So, me explaining it in this way, I'm saying it's embodying it where they would say it as a mental representation. It doesn't change the experience on the part of the person, but this isn't one of those places necessarily where you would have two different predictions. There are a lot of places where you would have two different predictions, and that's what we spend a lot of time in ecological is saying, okay, well, the classical approach would predict this and the ecological approach would predict this. And so let's figure out what happens. And so this started to be one of the big conversations we were having, like behind the scenes as educators, is okay, but we have to be better than the book. We have to be something that the internet isn't. Like they can't just Google this problem and get an answer. We have to show them that. And so, like, one of the standards of are you doing a great job in the classroom is like, could they get what they got from you just by reading the book? Could they get what they got from you just by Googling the problem? And if the answer is yes, then you're not really adding anything. What are we adding if AI can just tell them what ecological means? You know, what am I adding to the conversation? But truthfully, you have to give them something that AI can't give them in order to be, you're a content maker, right? So you do YouTube, you think about it as like making content. We kind of think about it in the same way. We don't use the same language, but what is the content we are making? What is the thing we are adding to these students' lives? What are we giving them that they can't just get anywhere else? Right. So we think about it in a very similar way, like I said, just with different words. And I find that the more and more the content that I can add is the critical voice, being coming in and saying, look, this thing doesn't make sense. And here's why. And have you considered this? And I'm assuming you've done the reading. So what did you find in that reading that didn't make sense to you? And forcing them to think that critically. And more and more, I'm finding that critical voice is the thing that the internet does not give, right? AI does not give.
Would you think it looks like on the other side when there is the shift, when it does
Yes.
tip over?
So you have this heliocentric view, paradigm shift, where we went from an Earth centric to a sun centric view of the universe. And it changed everything. It changed everything about the way that they understood gravity. It changed everything about the way that they understood the movement of the planets and the stars, and everything kind of snapped into a place that in a way that it hadn't before. So that paradigm shift changed everything for that. I think this is the same way. I think if you can really make this paradigm shift, you're going to get the kind of heliocentric revolution, but in psychology, right? In education and sports and all of those areas it touches. I don't think that the everyday life of the everyday person is necessarily going to be radically changed, but science could be radically changed by thinking about things in this way because it is fundamentally different. It's not just a different way of instantiating the previous ideas. It is a fundamental shift. And fundamental shifts are always accompanied by brand new avenues of research and brand new ways of doing things. And I think a shift to an ecological view could finally make AI actual AI, right? Have it be an emergent life form and rather than just something that can write terrible essays.
Just to step in quickly here, the shift we're talking about is not a day or a week or a month or even years. It's decades and centuries long to be able to shift these sorts of things in science and everyday behaviours, but there was no nice little section I could cut up from the conversation. It was sporadically put out, so here's that disclaimer, caveat, bit of nuance.
The first thing I want to say is that one of the things about the ecological approach is not looking at artificial circumstances, but trying to look at things in the way that they actually happen. And I think what you pointed out is really good is that my mom probably does consider what other people are capable of and what they care about, what they want, all of which she considers not using the language of ecological psychology, right? So, but it is those things. right? So in the same way that when I wield that stick and I know that the weight at the end would be do good bludgeoning damage, I know that even if I don't use the language of rotational dynamics, right? Like prior to learning about it, I didn't know about rotational dynamics, but I knew that thing would make a good mace, right? So you may not know the language to describe the thing you're doing, but the thing you're doing is ecological anyway. So I wonder if like daily interactions sort of fall into this same category. Like, good interactions are ones where we are trying to imagine each other complexly, where we're trying to imagine what this person is capable of, what this person might want to do for me, what I might want to do for them, right? Those kinds of ecological level ideas, but without naming them as affordances or effectivities or any of those other things that are the language we use in the field, right? So it's like, we're really just describing something that's already happening. So I don't, like I said, I don't know that it would actually change the everyday interactions. We just might have a different language for explaining what we did and why.
I feel like that's what taking an ecological approach may look like, because as you say, we're already doing it. It's the
Mhm.
shift in language, and that's what for me makes the approach useful. I can explain my experiences as the experiences that they are, not trying to use words that don't quite match the way that
Yeah.
I experience the world, i.e., working memory capacity, limit, load, cognitive load of whatever situation.
Yeah.
They don't quite work.
Yeah. Yeah. And you can instead use this language that is going to do a better job explaining what it is that you're understanding or what it is that you're experiencing, right? So it's like I said, on a daily level, I think it's a language shift. For scientists, for practitioners, I think it could be as big as a heliocentric revolution. I think it could be a completely different way of approaching therapy, a completely different way, right? Because you think about the fact that we are systems and our emotional health or mental health is a system as well as everything else. It may be that the way to help somebody who's in a mental health crisis has nothing to do with talking to them through their current mental health crisis, right? It could be you go and you change something over here and it changes the constraints on the system and they feel better, right? Like we're learning a lot about the way that our gut biome affects our mental health. So it's like this person is having a mental health crisis. Cool, eat more yogurt. Like not that the answers to mental health are going to be that simplistic, but do you know what I mean? Like it might change the way that we look at those things if we recognize that these non-obvious causes could be changing, like just change a constraint in just the right way, and you might radically change the behavior that emerges out of that person. So I think it could change education. I think it's changing sports. I think it's, little by little, it could really change a lot of different areas of psychology. You know, in science will use it every day.
This was an unstructured conversation with Julia, and I've mashed it together, cut it up to make it into a half-hour video rather than a 2-hour long conversation. But if you do have any questions, leave them in the comment section below and I'll try and get back to them as quickly as I can. But there is a video here that goes over the book and goes into more detail about the nuances of things that we were discussing.